All right, so this is chapter 1, Introduction and Research Methods. So let's get into it. All right, so first up, I want you to be familiar with how psychology is defined as you see it here. Textbook, directly from your textbook, this is what you'll see on your chapter 1 exam. So psychology is the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. So I like to break this term down, or this definition down, by having students to think of psychology as the study of our actions and our thought processes, because that's all behavior and mental processes is. Behaviors are our actions, mental processes is how we think, how we process things, how we label them, our perception of it, how we organize it. That's all mental processing, but that's a part of thinking. So our behaviors, our actions, mental processing, our thinking. All right, so now we're going to jump into some of the most influential people, contributors to psychology as we know it. So we're starting all the way back, BC, with Aristotle. What I want you to know about Aristotle, as far as what you'll see on the exam and what they're talking about and kind of mentioning in the textbook in chapter 1, is Aristotle was considered the father of psychology. Now, he was considered the father of psychology because he was the first person that has been recognized as discussing, theorizing, talking about psychological topics. And this was in BC. So as you can see, we have Rene Descartes in the 1500s, but this was done in like the 300s with Aristotle. So this is one reason why he's considered the father of psychology, is because of how far back it dates. Now, the theorized psychological topics that he would mention, he would theorize about, talk about, try to do further research on were topics as they relate to sensation and perception, which we'll talk about over the course of this semester. Also topics about history, the history of psychology, memory, also some bits and pieces of learning and personality as well. So those were some of the early psychological topics that Aristotle discussed. He's considered the father of psychology because that was during the 300s. First person theorized psychological topics. All right. Next up, we're going to talk about Rene Descartes. All right. So his major contribution, or what he's most well known for, is interactive dualism, as you see here. And here's the definition for interactive dualism, which is nice for you all to understand what that is versus this is just what you need to know about him. So dualism, dual tells you two, okay? So interactive dualism, his theory is that the mind and body operate as separate entities as it relates to sensation and perception and our emotions and other conscious experiences. So his thought process was that the mind and body don't talk to each other, don't communicate with each other. They act as separate things altogether, which is not typically how we theorize things now, because if you think about it, the brain, the body, the mind controls the body. And so those, of course, it was an early theory, but it was related to psychology. Not that we're still on that theory anymore. We've definitely graduated and expounded upon that, and we know differently for that to not be true, but that the mind and body work together. All right, but that was what his theory was, and that was his contribution to psychology. Next, you have the nature versus nurture issue. You may also see it as nature versus nurture debate. It's the same thing. What nature is we are who we are. That whole argument is we are who we are based on our biological makeup, based on our DNA. And nurture is we are who we are based on our experiences and our environment. And so you have had a group of people that feel that they're strictly on the nature side. You are who you are, strictly based on biological makeup, your DNA, your experiences don't influence how you are as an individual. Your environment doesn't influence you as an individual, and that's their belief. And then you have people that are strictly nurture. You are who you are based on your environment, based on your experience. Your DNA, your biological makeup has nothing to do with it. And then you have the rest of us that say, when you think about it, if we take those two things, both of them have a major contribution to who we are as an individual. It definitely affects our personality. And so that is the whole nature versus nurture issue or debate. So be familiar with that. All right, next up with another one of our contributors. His name is Wilhelm Wundt. Okay, so it's not Wilhelm Wundt, as you want to say, but Wilhelm Wundt, and it's because he was German. So his contribution, or what you see here, is he's listed as the founder of psychology. Well, it's kind of hard to say he's the founder of psychology when we just talked about Aristotle, who was talking about psychological topics in the 300s. So I'll always say, think of Wilhelm Wundt as the father of modern psychology, because this is in the 1800s versus way back almost 1500 years ago. Okay, so founder of modern psychology is what I would do to make a note. Second major thing about Wilhelm Wundt is the second bullet here, is that he established the first psych lab at the University of Leipzig, and this was in Germany. Okay, so make sure you know that about Wilhelm Wundt. Now, this is not the last time you're going to hear about him, because you're actually going to hear about him in the next slide. So let's go ahead and go over to the next slide. All right, here we have Edward Titchener. Well, as you can see in the first bullet, he was a student of Wundt's. So he was one of the students actually working in the psychology lab at the University of Leipzig. And so he went on to do more work as it relates to psychology as well. So what his further work was structuralism. So structuralism is kind of like the basic broken down pieces of our conscious awareness, what we're consciously aware of. So if you're listening to this, one of your conscious awareness will be you're consciously aware of me talking, and you're hearing my voice, and you're retaining the information, and you're categorizing it and ordering it in your brain. So that's the conscious experience. So he wanted to break down to the very smallest element of our conscious experience based on sensation and perception. So make sure you're familiar with that about Edward Titchener. Now, this is definitely not the last time you'll hear about Titchener either, because when we start talking about some of our influential women, we'll bring him back up. All right, but for the purposes of now, let's move along. All right, next up we have William James. Okay, William James is one of my favorite people to discuss, and it's because, of course, he developed the school of functionalism, but also really more so of what he did with how he invited women into the world of psychology, because at that time psychology really was a men's club. So it was, all boys, no girls allowed. So anything that was related to psychology was strictly for men, and any degrees and anything related to that was strictly men. So women were pretty much like banned from psychology, almost to a certain extent. They didn't want them in. They definitely weren't inviting them. But, he definitely took a different approach. So definitely appreciative of that. From William James. All right. Main thing about him was he developed functionalism as a further breakdown of functionalism, how it relates to behaviors and us adapting to the environment, and also really him focusing on how we function in our normal habitat, our normal environment. So it's a bit of observational learning is what he did. But if you just kind of focus on the second and third bullet, you'll have what you need for William James. Now we're going to talk about him when we talk about the women as well, so you'll need to add something to that with William James, but you'll see in just a second. All right, so I'm going to go back to G. Stanley Hall, but let me go forward to Mary Whiton Calkins as a segue from William James. Now their connection was, I just told you, women were pretty much barred and banned and not wanted or welcomed in psychology, but she was the first woman to actually want to pursue her PhD in psychology from a school that was not a traditional woman's college. Okay, So William James, just to go back real quick because I forgot to mention this, he developed the first psychology lab at Harvard University. And so make sure you make a note of that. Well, Mary Whiton Calkins went to Harvard University. Of course, she's applying and she's trying to become a student in the psychology program, and that was what William James headed up. So he said, of course, you can come into our program. Well, the president of Harvard University was not too happy about that, and so he goes to William James and says, hey, what are you doing? This is for men. She's a woman. Have you lost your mind? Okay, he's like, no, haven't lost it. I don't see any problem with her being in this program. So, you know, the president of Harvard University at that time was like, well, you know, it's on you. You're going to have to do everything as it relates to her. And he's like, okay, I'm fine with it. So I'm assuming that the Harvard University president is not thinking she's going to follow through with this and actually complete the program. So he leaves it alone for the, for now. Well, that was the first part of her hurdle, okay? The second part of her hurdle was when William James brought her in, he had all male students, of course, because this is a man's program. So the guys in the program say, hey, what are you doing, Professor James? She's a woman. He's like, she wants to earn her PhD in psychology just like you guys. I don't see the problem. The guys give him an ultimatum. It's either Mary Whiton Calkins or it's us. So I guess it was just Mary Whiton Calkins. All the guys end up leaving the program because William James welcomed her in and was going to mentor her and take her through the program himself. And that's exactly what he did. Well, she comes up to the very end of the program, and here comes Harvard University president again saying, haha, I won't give you a stamp from Harvard University saying that you completed your degree because you're a woman. If you want your PhD and you want your degree, you can go to our sister college. That's a woman's college, and you can get their stamp on it. We'll give them all your work, but you're not going to have a Harvard University stamp. Blows her mind, blows William James' mind for sure. So Mary Whiton Calkins, she looks pretty tough. I think she was a pretty rough woman. And she said, I'm assuming I'm not going to a women's college because I didn't receive, earn, get any studying, get any information, any knowledge. I didn't attend that school. I want my degree from Harvard. And if you're not going to give it to me, then I guess I won't have it. So she actually was the first woman to complete, first American woman to complete her PhD work, just never received that degree because she was a female. Now, she didn't let that stop her in the world of psychology. She went on, okay? Second thing I want you to be familiar with about her is she went on to become the first American woman to become a president of the APA, which is the American Psychological Association. So that's Mary Whiton Calkins and her relationship with William James in a nutshell. And that's why I liked him, because he was inviting. He didn't turn anyone away. All right, G. Stanley Hall, very prominent person in psychology. Okay, he established the first psychology lab in the United States. He did this at Johns Hopkins University. He also, which is huge and major, founded the American Psychological Association, APA, which many of you have heard of, but typically when you hear of it, because most people aren't a psychology major, when they hear of it, they hear of it as it relates to like a research paper. Well, it's the same thing. Psychology is based on research, so it's a certain code and rules and regulations you have to follow in order to complete research correctly, the right way. So he developed that, he founded that, and founded the first psych lab in the university, at Johns Hopkins University in the United States. So be familiar with him. All right, our next woman is Margaret Floyd Washburn. Now, I told you you would hear about Titchener again. Well, they have the same relationship that William James had with Mary Whiton Calkins. Edward Titchener has that same relationship with Margaret Floyd Washburn. Now, I don't know if it's the same as it relates to her being turned away or anything like that, but he was her mentor throughout her psychology program when she went on to earn her PhD. Now, I don't care for the word earn because it's like Mary didn't earn hers, but she did earn it. She just didn't receive it. So Margaret Floyd Washburn, make a note, was mentored by Edward Titchener. And she became the first American woman to earn or receive her official PhD in psychology. Now, Edward Titchener is not necessarily my favorite person because he contradicted himself, okay? And was very hypocritical to me because she was good enough for him to mentor, go through an entire program, become the first American woman to earn her or receive her official PhD in psychology, but yet Edward Titchener had an organization that was for prominent psychologists who did research, who wrote psychological textbooks and or published their research. And so it was a really, pretty much a major organization. And Margaret Floyd Washburn wanted to become a member. Quite naturally, she's like, hey, my mentor, this is his organization. He's taught me everything he knows. He's even said my work is great, and he's even published, yes, he published some of her work as a part of the organization, but when she asked to become a part of the organization, he turned her down. And so she's confused, like, well, why are you turning me down? You've even published my articles, my works, and things like that. He said, well, Margaret, because you're a woman. And so that was the female situation coming around again. And so that is her relationship with Edward Titchener. He's not necessarily my favorite guy because he was conflicted, okay? I just didn't understand how she was good enough. If you're mentoring someone, then you know their level of expertise, you know their work, you've taught them that. But then for them to not be good enough just strictly because of the anatomy, that's an issue. So that was their relationship, so I'll get off that soapbox. But continuing on. All right, Francis Sumner, first African American to receive his PhD in psychology, and he was awarded this degree at Clark University, which is close to us. All right, first point. Second point I want you to make is that he went on to work and develop psychology programs at Howard University and worked with so many other African American students that wanted to pursue their degrees in psychology as well. So he opened the doors for many people at Howard University once he received his PhD in psychology. So be familiar with that about Francis Sumner. All right, Sigmund Freud. So he is a major contributor to the world of psychology. You'll hear about Sigmund Freud in almost every single chapter, maybe except 2 or 3. That's how influential he was to psychology. Highly sexual, controversial with some of his sexual connections to theories and things like that. But if you can kind of take some of the sex out of it, he was a genius. Okay, he was a psychological genius. All right, so it's so much you would need to know about Sigmund Freud. They really can't sum that up in one slide. So for now, they're just focusing on one main point, which is psychoanalysis. So for the purpose of chapter 1, assessment, exam, just be familiar with his work with psychoanalysis. And psychoanalysis, what he created, has 2 different definitions. One version of psychoanalysis focuses on our personality, okay, and how our personality is broken down and how it evolves from infancy on until early childhood, okay, and then later on, of course, until adulthood. And then it is also a part of psychotherapy. So when we talk about therapies, it is actually, psychoanalysis is the kind of the conglomerate of a psychotherapy techniques, which has free association, transference, analyzing dream interpretation, things of that nature. So it has 2 different meanings for the same word. Don't know why Sigmund Freud couldn't come up with a different word, but nevertheless, its relation to personality and its relation to psychotherapy. And the first bullet here just gives you an idea of what it is altogether right here. So be familiar with that about Sigmund Freud and psychoanalysis. All right, behaviorism. Behaviorism, what we're going to do is start talking about the major contributors that were a part of behaviorism. What behaviorism focuses on is behaviors, okay? Just to make it simple and plain. And so also the focus with the behaviors is how we study, how we observe behaviors, through how we measure them and how they're verified. So be familiar with behaviorism, and then let's look at some of the behaviorists that contributed to early psychology. All right, so our first person is Ivan Pavlov. Our second person is John Watson. We're going to talk about behaviors and behaviorism and these two theorists when we get into the chapter on learning. So first up, Ivan Pavlov. First thing you need to know about him was, of course, he was a contributor to behaviorism. Second thing was he was a Russian physiologist. And then the third thing was he was most well known for his work with classical conditioning, where he demonstrated that dogs could learn to associate a neutral stimulus, which means something that means nothing, and how you can link it with a behavior such as a dog salivating to food, but then he gets the dog to salivate at the sound of the bell versus the dog salivating at the sight of the food. And so it's a whole thing with classical conditioning. Trust me, it'll make sense once you get there. But he won a Nobel Prize for his work with dogs and classical conditioning. All right, John Watson. Excuse me. He was most well known for, of course, behaviorism, but he had a highly controversial, unethical study that he did, famous study with little Albert. And so what he did was very similar to Pavlov with like association, but he did it with fear. And so what he did with the little Albert experiment was he took a baby named Albert and he brought let's say a rat out, okay, a furry white rat or furry white mouse. He brought that animal out. And so the child naturally is trying to touch it, pet it, because children aren't fearful of those things naturally. Adults, caregivers, people around them are the ones that cause them to fear something, because we scream and say, hey, no, don't touch that. That scares the child. The child creates an association. So what happened was mouse comes out, and what Watson and his assistant, Rosalie Rayner, does, they take a hammer and they have a steel bar and they hit the steel bar with the hammer and it makes a loud noise. But the loud noise scares the baby. And so after it scares the baby starts to cry. Well, they do that a couple of times. So where now that they have an association created, so when the baby sees the mouse, white furry mouse, who the child was not afraid of at first, is now afraid of it because the child is anticipating, now has fear because of the loud noise that they created the association for. And they did this to the point where it pretty much traumatized the child, where the child would cry and have a fit when just seeing a cotton ball, because it was furry and had some type of generalization of where it resembled the white furry mouse that the child had been conditioned to. So that was his work for Watson. Now you will also hear about Watson with Rosalie Rayner, his assistant. Now, he was married to a very affluent woman. So her and her family were very, very rich, and her and her family were very, very well known, respected, and probably feared a little bit. And so he had an affair with Rosalie Rayner, his assistant. Well, his wife finds out about it, and I'm sure an affluent woman that's very rich took it a little bit harsh to say, okay, you're not even going to cheat with someone that is affluent and rich like me. You're going to cheat with your assistant. So I think it bruised her ego a little bit, to the point where she ran it in the newspaper that he and her had an affair. that wasn't enough for her to just divorce him. She had to run it in the paper. And then her and her family also went to anyone, I don't know what the radius was, anyone close enough that they could get to in the world of psychology, and pretty much dared them to not touch him, not work with him. Okay, or maybe something awful was going to happen. So he was blackballed from psychology. So he ended up having to go into the world of advertisement because he couldn't get a job in psychology anymore after he cheated with his wife. So when you see that, when you read that later on in learning, that's why he got pulled or pushed into advertising, because he cheated on his wife and got blackballed from psychology. Interesting. All right, next up and continuing on with our behaviorist, we have B.F. Skinner. B.F. Skinner is going to be well known for his work with operant conditioning and his work with animals. And so his work with operant conditioning, the whole premise of that is that operant conditioning focuses on strengthening or weakening a behavior based on a reinforcer or a punishment. So he worked with animals. So if an animal performed a task he wanted the animal to perform, he would give that animal basically like a treat, food or water or something like that. It was a reinforcement. And so it strengthened the behavior for the animal to be likely to perform that task again. And so that was his major work. And he also created the Skinner box, which is also called the operant chamber. So that's what you'll need to know about B.F. Skinner. All right, Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow, those are going to be people. Carl Rogers is going to be someone that we hear about, talk about when we go into therapies, which is probably going to be like the second to last week in the course for the semester. So we'll hear about him again. You don't need to take too much away from him right now, but he focused on positive psychology, came up with active listening, positive, unconditional positive regard, where he has a non-judgmental type of therapy. That's his therapy or therapeutic technique. Abraham Maslow is going to be talked about or discussed when we get into motivation and emotion. And what he's most well known for was the creation of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is a pyramid that works from the bottom up, and it's based on our priorities. So just for example, at the bottom of the pyramid, we have the basic needs of food and water, because if you don't have food and water, you can't survive, so you're definitely not worrying about the next thing. But let's say on 2 tiers up from the basic, it says the need for love or belongingness. Well, his whole thing his whole theory is, if you don't have the basic food or water, you're not going to be worried about the 3rd tier or prioritizing the 3rd tier of trying to get a boyfriend or girlfriend or a best friend if you don't even have your basic needs met. So you'll see that throughout the pyramid and the explanation of the pyramid with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. All right, we're going to talk about the different perspectives. They're just breaking it down. So for right now, this is FYI. You'll be going into biology, the biological perspective, neuroscience on next week. So you'll get there. All right, just FYI for now. Next one, psychodynamic. When we talk about personalities, you see Freud there. All right, so FYI for now, we'll get there. Behaviors, we'll get there when we talk about learning. FYI for now, humanistic. When we get into therapies and motivation and emotion. FYI for now, positive psychology towards the end of the semester. Just giving you an introduction right now. Cognitive perspective when we get into thinking and intelligence. We'll get there. All right. Culture. Put an asterisk by culture with the definitions, attitude, or definition, attitudes, values, beliefs, and behaviors shared by a group of people. So be familiar with that. Put a little asterisk by it. Can't remember if that's on the study guide or not, but put an asterisk by it just in case. All right, we'll discuss the individualistic cultures, collectivistic cultures, and ethnocentrism when we go into social psychology. So again, it's just giving you an introduction right now. We're going to get into all of this a little bit deeper. All right, evolutionary perspective. As we go through the semester, we'll get there. All right. Definitely want you to be familiar with the difference between psychologists and psychiatrists. For sure, you'll see that on your Chapter 1 exam. So psychologists, just with the degrees first and foremost, psychologists hold a PhD or a Psych D or EDD degree. A psychiatrist holds a medical degree, a MD or DO, which means that this person, a psychiatrist, is the only person that has the specialized training in the writing of prescriptions and administering medications, okay? Only one that can do that. Now, they can both diagnose, establish treatment plans, things of that nature. But psychiatrists, only one with the prescription pad, okay? Now, I will say psychologists really are going to be the ones that are going to try or develop treatment plans that are not medication solely focused, okay? They're going to go through therapy with that individual and assist them with preventing their psychological disorder, or if they already have a diagnosed psychological disorder, how to help them function better with that disorder. So they're more going to focus on the therapy. Psychiatrists really are going to focus more so on the therapy, but through medication and medical treatment, okay? All right, this is just good information to know. Not that you'll be tested on it, but it just breaks down the different specialties in psychology. So just FYI for you, but interesting to know. All right, and then the next half of the lecture slides will pick up on the scientific method, so I'll stop here.